I just finished my PhD at OpenLab in England, and before I start my presentation today, I would like to share with you my childhood dream. Ever since I can remember, I wanted to study architecture and become an interior designer. But for some reason, I ended up studying computing, specializing in human-computer interaction and doing a master's in interaction design while working as a software developer and while working as an interior designer part-time. At some point in my life, I just wanted to bring my two selves together. And to do that, I came up with this PhD proposal of interioraction design, this interdisciplinary concept that I was hoping to bring technology closer to interior design and our everyday spaces. And so when you start a PhD, start by looking at previous work and the literature that was out there at that time, the prominent work of MIT Media Lab that you can see on the right-hand side. The transform interactive furniture or table that, as I remember, had 1,152 motor actuators. Underneath each pin, there was a motor actuating that pin up and down at various heights and speeds. And the idea was that there is a Kinect and cameras that can detect people's interaction on top of the table and accommodate that interaction by a shape-changing table. On your left, you can see Bill Gaber's prominent history tablecloth. It was meant to be a tablecloth, but at that time, they weren't able to make it as a cloth, so they made it as LED pattern, light emitting, under a glass top. And the idea behind that work is studying how people would interact with it on a daily basis. So they deployed it in a real household rather than studying it in a lab. And for 3 months, a couple who lived in that apartment placed things on that kitchen table and started studying how the pattern changed over time with the pressure sensors underneath that table connecting to a computer system would log all this interaction and the history that fades these illuminating patterns. And so, interesting and inspiring, I looked at more shape-changing technology. And what I found was, again, more motors, light emissive displays, light projection. Interesting work, but might not be what most people would like to live with. So what I had in mind was something different, was something more like this. Things that are already in our homes, things that don't look like devices or machines. Technology that is weaved within the fabric of the building elements, the interior design elements, the things that we already have and cherish for maybe aesthetic reasons, maybe to complement our space, maybe to give it character or an identity. But then, can they do more? Can they be smart in any way? Can they change their appearance to interact with us, or to interact with each other, or maybe to interact with the surrounding environment? So, how can we do that? I started by looking into material science and what it can offer us, instead of relying on electronic components that can be rigid or bulky, or compromise the aesthetic or the affordance of everyday materials, such as soft furnishing. And what I found in material science that can help us are a variety of materials. So you can see from conductive sheets and metal powders that can be inlaid in wooden objects such as furniture and tables and make them touch sensitive in any kind of engraving that you design, up till threads and fabrics that are conductive. They have thin conductive yarns woven inside them with copper, silver, or stainless steel You wouldn't see that. You would perceive it as normal threads or fabrics, but then they have this conductive physical property. So not only can they connect electric current, but also they can be crafted into sensors because of their conductivity. Imagine them exactly performing like your smartphone touchscreen, because they have this capacitive sensing property. So if you pick that fabric, for instance, you can machine sew it into a sensor. So for example, these two conductive fabrics I've made into a double sensor, a double frill sensor. So you can stroke them together, rub them, or flip them. All these gestures are considered like input to whatever output you can connect it to. You can also knit them into stretch sensors, or squeeze sensors, or felt them, like I've done there in that flower, or embroider them, whether you prefer hand embroidery or even digital embroidery with a digital sewing machine. So you can digitally design the pattern, and it can embroider them into soft inputs or sensors. Instead of having bulky, rigid buttons and light switches, for instance, you can have that embroidered in whatever pattern on your headboard, for instance, or on your jacket. So another material that I also found in material science were color-changing pigments. So there are some pigments that have chemical properties to change their color, whether responding to heat, like thermochromics, or light, like photochromics, or water or liquid, like hydrochromics. These pigments you can use to dye fabrics, threads, or acrylic paints and paint with them. So imagine all the things you can do with fabric that is dyed with thermochromic pigments that changes its color of the whole fabric, not just with illuminating LEDs. For example, here is yarn that was originally white, and I dyed it with thermochromic blue. And so you see it blue, and then knit with it, and then I weave conductive thread inside that knit. And so with electric current, it heats up, slowly and gradually transitioning and changing color back to white, or pink in that example. And so it's quite seamless. You wouldn't perceive it as a device, and many people would envision that in various elements in the interior space. Last but not least, the most magical of them all, shape-changing wires. They're hair-thin and quite light, silently actuating, changing shape. This shape memory alloy, or SMA, commonly often known as nitinol, flexinol, or muscle wire, used often for magic tricks, it can be sewn to fabric as well. It can be fixed to whatever pattern you want, wood, acrylic, any material, you name it. And then it can be trained to remember any shape you want. So you can train it or 400, 500 degrees Celsius on whatever shape you fixed it on. And then in room temperature, it's quite malleable. So whatever you fix it to, you can change that shape. If it's a soft thing, you wouldn't feel the wire almost inside. It's as if you're sewing thread. But then once it gets enough heat, then it returns back to that shape. So imagine it sewn to a centerpiece, a decorative element in this space. And that piece can change its shape in different deformations to interact with us in different ways. Imagine adding that to the other materials we talked about, color change and conductive fabric for the seamless soft sensing, and you get something that changes color, changes shape in response to visible sensing. No camera is needed. This is a video of how it works. So this is a shape change. And the music just happened to sync nicely. It's not responding to it. And then there's another version for color change as well, with seamless touch sensing. So inside that fabric, there is a layer of convective fabric with a seamless touch sensing. Wherever you pass the salt or put something on it, it responds. And there is the thermochromic patterns that reveal and hide in the color changing fabric. So after that, we take these pieces and study them in the wild. We would take them to homes and restaurants and explore how people would perceive them, how would they interact with them, how would they engage together through these pieces, how would they learn how they interact with them, because I don't tell them anything. I basically put them there and observe from behind the scenes how they dine around them. And the interesting thing is, some people wouldn't even see anything or feel anything awkward until like later in their dinner. So some of these findings led to the fact that this kind of technology is not focus demanding, not distracting technology, not supporting individualism like other technology, but rather supporting social engagement, collaborative work, or ice-breaking and conversation material. So people would play together through it and have interesting theories on how it's working and why it's changing color here or changing shape there. Oh yeah, because he's talking more and we're eating less, or something like that. People would theorize that it's part of the space because it was designed to be aesthetically complementing the decorative scheme of the place it's put on. So, for example, the color-changing patterns are the same patterns in the floor tiles, and the colors of the petals are the same colors in the fabric of the chairs, and so on. So they would theorize, without telling them anything, that, oh, it's probably doing this because I've touched that, or because the music is now louder, or because he's sitting over there, so that's why it's moving much more on his side, and so on. So they're perceiving it much more as a spatial experience rather than a device, an Amazon or Alexa that is sat on the table. But it's rather part of the interior design, part of the space. So the space is engaging with them. Another study that we've had earlier was in the School of Architecture, collaborating with interior designers. And there we made like a gallery space that was all filled with installations that is interactive in the same way. So wall panels, chairs, and a treasure at the end because it was themed like Alice in the Wonderland. It was designed like clues leading from one to another. So people would be engaging with them and finding out the way out of the maze. So it was quite interesting. And to see people, how they engage with these things is quite research in itself. So that was another example that is, again, in a different context. The Great North Museum was having an exhibition around bees, and I was given that gallery space where we wanted to design a human-scale beehive. So people would wander inside and start interacting with the space itself. So this interactive space had wall panels that had seamless touch sensing behind. So the paint itself was touch sensitive, so they would glide their hands on the wall panels and it would instantly talk to them in the first-person narrative and tell them about life mysteriously inside the hive. And for example, we would have the audio quite specifically. So, for example, the queen would talk in an old lady's voice, and the workers would be female voices, while eggs and larvae would be like children and toddlers' voices, and so on. So there were also hexagons of soft pollen made out of conductive yarns that are colorful, and hexagons of honey wax, real honey wax. And people would touch it to hear it talking to them about honey wax in the hive and why it's useful in the first person. And then they would get struck by, it's real honey, it's sticky. And they would smell it, and they would often lick it. And they would be like, what? How? And it's talking to them, how come honey can be conductive? And that actually encounters the mindset that some people often have of technology that is often simulated or sometimes not quite real as the real world. And in this work, you get technology or interactivity embedded within our real world. I get that this is a gallery, but you get the point. So this is another example, but this time about bacteria. And you might think, come on, what does these things have to do together? So what they have in common is the same exact concept, is embedding technology or interactivity seamlessly within the fabric itself of the elements of the space, what we call as the decorative scheme, the interior elements themselves. Without any holes in the walls, you get a piece of wall art that is designed in bacteria-inspired patterns, and it changes its shape with the shape-changing threads sewn to it, and it changes the color of the patterns with the thermochromic pigments it's painted in, and similarly with the embroidery. So once you touch it with the conductive fabric underneath, it immediately starts to sway and change in that way, as if it's visualizing the unseen members of our ecology. So it was basically to raise awareness of AMR, antimicrobial resistance. So public awareness now about how the excessive use of antibiotics is affecting how bacteria is developing resistance to us, potentially leading to a crisis. So in an aesthetic way, rather than scientific charts or graphs, you can raise conversation and discussion and public awareness about such a health-related issue. And so let me show you a video of how this is done. So I would train that shape memory wire on a sewing machine bobbin. And I just sew it to the fabric. I realized by different patterns of sewing and different stitches, you get different activations. You can see how it's seamless within the fabric. It's breathing as if it's alive, or creasing as if it's dying. Speaking of dyeing, you can dye them with color-changing pigments. And you can digitally design these color-changing and shape-changing patterns. Just pop it into a digital sewing machine. then stitch the microcontrollers to it, stitch the conductive fabric, it becomes seamlessly touch sensitive, changing shape and changing color. And voila! So I would be there at the exhibition, observing from a distance how people interact with it, how they perceive it, how they do interesting, unexpected interactions with it. So that was just published a couple of months ago. And so you can see where this is heading, right? It's like a new design space of products that you can design that are seamlessly interactive and can change their appearance in response to our actions or to the environment or to each other. So you can see, for example, these couple of throws that you can touch one, and then the other would be in a distant loved home, and then it would sway as if you're sending a tactile poke to them, other than digital notifications, right? You can see that curtain, that you can control its shape, not by a bulky button or switch that might not look nice, but rather the sensors are the tassels themselves. So as much as you tackle them and tickle them, it would change its shape. So ultimately, you would have something that looks like this, a product catalog of things that is the near future, is basically what can be, not what will be, but rather things that can interact with this, everyday objects that rely on these materials. They don't look like devices. They're touch sensitive. They're embedded in our real world and can be embroidered or can be sewn, can be inlaid in wooden engravings or in the walls themselves. So imagine a vase that can feel that there is flour or not inside and can change its shape to accommodate that, can sense the water inside, but not with electronics, not on your mobile notification, but rather can deform its physical shape to tell you or to make you notice or to avoid display blindness that happens to us when we see it every day just the same. So this was my research, and this is my last statement that I will leave you with. Bring your knowledge to your passion and change the world. Thank you so much.
One of our remote participants has a question for you, Sara. They ask, are those interactive materials prototypes, or are they ready for day-to-day usage? And the example they give is, like, could it go through a wash or a dryer cycle?
Oh, that's always the first question I get at every presentation. So usually what we say is don't wash them. So they are controlled by microcontrollers this big, stitched inside, so you won't feel any rigid electronics, okay? But try popping that into a washing machine, and I don't think it will like it. So I didn't do that. Most of the research relevant to this are in wearables. So people design garments that have interactive capabilities, but actually hasn't been studied enough yet, I think, in interior design. So the nice thing about interior design elements is that you don't wash them as often as clothes. So I think there is a potential here in case the wearable guys decide it's not washable.
So I would expect that probably answers the question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Thank you.
When you train the memory shape out of it, can you train it so that it can bend in certain ways, or does it just like curl up?
Well, it depends on the shape you train it to. So you fix it to whatever structure. Should be metal to resist the heat, I guess. And then you heat it enough on that shape. And then you bring it up. It's malleable, right? But once it gets a little bit of heat more, it returns again to that shape. So if you train it to do like a 2D star, which I've done before, and then you pull it apart, it's no longer a star. Once you give it electric current or like 50 to 70 degrees heat and like hot water or hot air gun or like a hair dryer, it returns to that star shape in the 2D. You can do it in a 3D, in a 3D printed mold. You can try that. And as I've done here, I've done it on a sewing bobbin. So it was trained to remember to turn to that swirly spring that has a wide diameter, so it curl the fabric. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It just reminds me of spiders, you know. How do you think it would be quicker to recommend my work from the Spider-Man?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So you can give it any input that you want. So whether that's physical input, voice input, or whatever, and the output would be the shape change. So in my work, I usually prefer the physical input. That's why I use conductive materials or conductive fabric, e-textiles inside, so that once you touch it, stroke it, or poke it, or feel it, or stretch it, it senses that and actuates accordingly. But you can certainly give it any input. Yeah. Curl. Yeah. Yeah. Interestingly, one group that I studied this actuator with, they were dining around it, and they noticed that it's changing shape. And one of them was like, "What? It's haunted!" And they didn't know what was causing the shape change at first, and I didn't want to tell them. And so they made like a group, okay? And they heated it up. And they kept doing this. And come on, let's warm it up. And one of them said, maybe it's voice. And he was like, in the power of me, rise. And I felt like it's getting away far. But it was interesting to see how people control these things. One of them shook hands with it. Like gripping it and like this. And with the bee wall panels, one of the visitors of the museum actually hugged it from the corner of the wall panel. It was like, oh, like it was, let me see if I can show you the voice. Oh yeah, here. So we talk to them. No voice?
All group of bees have to work together to make it. So each shaping and shooting while some need to be warm enough to move.
So you would hear that while smelling and licking the honey. And there were background bee noise. This is, let me show you what the larvae would say. No? Where is it? Oh, yeah. Oh.
I'm a big larva, and I grew fat because my sister fed me oil. Soon it will be time for them to cover my cell over with wax, so that I can hide away until I have grown into a proper bee like my big sisters.
So you would glide your hands on the wall, and once you glide your hands, for example, over larva, it would say that, okay? Once you glide your hands, for example, on that little egg, it would be like...
I am an egg that
So you can always play with the input and output. So in this case, the output was audio, not shape change, but the input was physical. And in the other one, it was the other way around. So the input, the output was physical, and they would theorize that the input was voice. So you can always alter whatever input and output you would want.
How much force can the flexible exert once you kind of like it? Obviously, the fabric is relatively light. At what point is it the fabric is too heavy, or you put too much weight on it? Does it not?
Well, that's a very good question. Answered that in like a 10 pages paper. But so each type of Flexinol comes with a pull force. And so the manufacturer would say, for example, that the pull force of this kind of wire is, for instance, 391 grams, okay? And that type would be thin. It would be 0.006 inches diameter. So it's like hair thin, literally. A thicker type, 0.010 inch diameter, would have twice as much pull force, 890, for example, grams. But then, the more it gets thicker, the more it gets rigid. And sometimes you don't want that in light, deformable objects, that you want them soft and nice. Yeah? But in other cases, if you're actuating, for example, there are architecture applications where they control the sunshade facades of the buildings, and they would need really thicker wires that have much more pull force. But the problem with these ones is that they need much more current to control them. And you wouldn't want that with something that people would touch. So, yeah. Sure. Any questions?
So it's not a question, but Andre says that he can see tabletop games using those materials to create really interesting experiences.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andre.
My question actually follows. From your research, have you seen any other contexts this could be applied for besides the core? Could you functionally process?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's just that, yes, the materials are out there. They're off the shelf. You can buy them online. Sorry. But then we're not there yet in a position that we really know how they work, much more organic, as opposed, for example, to motors, if you want. We can control motors very well now, and we can actually do the angle quite well and the time and everything. But here, the wire almost seems that it has a mind of its own. It's actuating and pulling and deforming according to how you interacted with it. So, for example, these strings, bacteria strands, so if you pull it too much, it would sway differently than if you pull it slightly. And if you bend it, it would twirl differently than if you didn't bend it. So things like that. Scientifically, they call it the austenite shape that you trained it to do, and the martensite shape that it's in the room temperature. And so this one depends on the former. And thank you.